So this will be the first in a series of short videos in which I go over the advanced level questions from the cross-text connections portion of the Khan Academy's website. Cross-text connections, or paired passages as I tend to call them. And a brief reminder that all of these Khan Academy materials are available for free on the Khan Academy's website. Okay, so number one here says or asks, based on the text, how would the author of text 2 most likely respond to the assertion and the underlined portion of text 1? And this is a really common prompt. And so what do we do with this prompt? Well, we want to read passage 1 and make sure that we understand the underlined portion, summarize it in a few words, and then go into text 2, read that with the underlined portion or our summary of the underlined portion in mind. Okay, so we're going to encounter some tough vocabulary here, potentially tough vocabulary, but we'll navigate it as best we can. So growth in the use of novel nanohybrids, or materials created from the conjugation of multiple distinct nanomaterials, such as iron oxide and gold nanomaterials conjugated for use in magnetic imaging. Deep breath. Okay, the growth in the use of these novel nanohybrids has outpaced the studies of nanohybrids' environmental risks. So in other words, they're creating, they meaning, scientists, researchers are creating a lot of these novel nanohybrids, but the testing hasn't kept up. So, okay, and then mention vocabulary. Conjugation is a word that I often hear in the grammatical context, like conjugating a verb, but here it means something like combining or join together. And then the prefix nano means really small. I think it has something to do with 10 to the negative 9th. I think there's a connection between 9 and nano, but in any event, it just means really small. Okay, so next sentence. Unfortunately, risk evaluations based on nanohybrids constituents, we could think components or just parts, are not reliable. And why is that? Because conjugation may alter the properties of the parts in such a way that innocuous, good vocabulary word to make sure that you know, harmless nanomaterials form a nanohybrid that is anything but harmless, meaning you can have harmless components that join together to create a hybrid that is harmful or dangerous. Okay, so how could we summarize this then? Nanohybrids, I'm just going to say risky even if components not. Okay. That's already more words than I like to use. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, even though it is a pretty abbreviated summary. But the hybrids can be risky even if the components themselves are not risky. Okay, so what would the second passage say about that? Well, it says the potential for enhanced toxicity of nanohybrids relative to the toxicity of constituent nanomaterials or their constituent parts has drawn deserved attention, but the effects of nanomaterial conjugation vary case by case. So they acknowledge that it is an issue. This is a potential issue because the attention that it has drawn has been deserved. But they go on to say that the effects vary case by case. So, for example, it was recently shown that a nanohybrid of these materials preserved the desired optical transparency of zinc oxide nanoparticles while mitigating the nanoparticles' potential to damage DNA. Okay, so again, a lot of vocabulary here. Mitigating, we could just say lessening or reducing, cutting down on. And the other vocabulary in here I'm going to say is not particularly important. I mean, the names of these elements or compounds really don't matter. Okay, the important thing here is that this hybrid did something positive, preserving the desired optical transparency of zinc oxide nanoparticles while mitigating the potential damage to DNA. So mitigating, lessening, cutting down on. The important thing is that we have one example given of a nanohybrid that is not dangerous. Something good happened, and that good outcome, the, as it says here, desired optical transparency, was accompanied by at least not an increase in risk, right? What the first author is worried about. So it's not always risky or dangerous, even though it can be, this process of creating nanohybrids. And so that should be enough to get us to our correct answer. And so we look at answer choice A. By denying that the circumstance is likely to occur. Well, no, they don't deny that this circumstance is likely to occur. They acknowledge that it is a potential issue. They just say that it's not inevitable. And so that takes us to B, which is going to be our correct answer. They agree that the possibility is a cause for concern, but they point out that it does not inevitably produce that result. Why does it not inevitably produce that result? Because the effects vary case by case, and in at least one case, the case given here, the example given, it didn't happen. You didn't have an increased risk or increased toxicity emerging due to this hybrid that was created. And so B will be correct, but I'll admit when I first did this one, I was either really close to picking or maybe even did pick C. And so why is C not correct? Because we look at this and we see that the first part of C is really similar to the first part of B. By agreeing that the possibility described as a cause for concern, by agreeing that the risk described in text 1, the possibility described in text 1 should be evaluated. Those first parts are, as far as I'm concerned, equivalent. They don't really give us any, there's not really much daylight in between those two in terms of, pointing us to the correct answer. So we have to look to the other parts. And again, B is correct in its second part. C is not, because the second passage doesn't say that the risk is more than offset by the potential benefits. It's tempting because they do talk about a benefit, but that's just one specific case. It's not always that way. So B, when we look at it, is actually, it's not as hard to support. It's not as hard to support. It doesn't take as much evidence to support this claim that I've just underlined in yellow, because to say it does not inevitably produce that result, you're just saying it's not always like that. Whereas with C, to say that the risk is more than offset by the potential benefits, that's a generalization, and they're just not making that broad of a generalization in terms of risks versus benefits. And then D, they don't really argue that the situation described in text 1 is representative or not. I guess they would be referring to this specific example. But yeah, they're not. It's not about what's representative or not. Conceding that the effects are harder to predict. D, the second passage is not really about unpredictability. So I'm just going to say neither one of those really fits at all. Again, it comes back to B versus C. And I think maybe the big takeaway from this one, apart from just the vocabulary, is the idea that you have to make sure to read the whole answer choice, because you're going to have incorrect answers that start off really good. The whole thing has to be correct, or at least not incorrect, in order for the answer choice to be correct.